Hello and welcome to my channel, Homemade Mathematics. If you haven't watched the previous 3 episodes in the series, I do suggest you go do that because today we're going to be putting it all together to graph a parabola by hand. All right, my first video we looked at x-intercepts, so setting y equal to 0 and solving for x. In the second video we looked at finding y-intercepts, so setting x equal to 0 and then solving for y. And then lastly we found how we could find the vertex. All right, and today we're going to put all 3 things together so that we can graph these parabolas by hand.
All right, so for our first problem here, we have our quadratic in standard form where a, or the number in front of x squared, is equal to 1. All right, and I do have a whole video on how to factor this, so if you want to see that, go check that out. But pretty much we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to get us our constant and add to get us that number in front of x. So I start by listing my factors of 12, and then I decide, okay, which of those would add up to get me a positive 8, 2, and 6. Now with graphing, the first thing I'm going to want to find is those x-intercepts, which remember we talked about to be an x-intercept, our y would equal 0. So instead of y here, we're going to make it 0. Which then we know we can set both of those pieces equal to 0 and solve for x to get our 2 x-intercepts. So I'll set my first one equal to 0, my second one equal to 0, and then solve for x. All right, so I have my 2 x-intercepts at -2, 0, and -6, 0. So I'm going to go ahead and graph my x-intercepts. If you watched my video on finding y-intercepts, you'll know that we could either set x equal to 0 like we just did with setting y equal to 0 and then solving for x. We could do the same thing, set our x equal to 0 and then solve for y. Or if you watched that last video, you'll know in standard form, our y-intercept is just that constant. So our y-intercept is at a positive 12, which makes sense because if I plugged in 0 for x, you'll notice I get a positive 12. All right, and then the last thing we have to find is our vertex, which we should expect to be directly between my 2 x-intercepts at -2, -6. All right, we can find that x by finding what is in between those two, which we could count, right? 1, 2, 1, 2, and we notice -4 is in the middle. All right, you could also find the average by adding them. -2 plus -6 is -8, divided by 2 to find the average, -4. So either way, we get that our vertex is going to have an x of -4. Know the x. To find the y, we can just plug that back in to the original equation. So instead of x, we know for the vertex, x is going to equal -4. And then go ahead and solve it out. -4 squared would be 16. 8 times a -4 would be -32. Plus 12, so this would get me -16 plus 12, gets me that y would equal -4. All right, so we have my x at -4 and my y at -4, so then that is my vertex. Go ahead and plot that point, -4, -4. All right, now I have enough that I should be able to get an idea of what this parabola is going to look like by connecting those dots. And there you go, you graphed it by hand. All right, for the second one, it's already factored into its 2 pieces. And then remember to find the x-intercepts, we would set y equal to 0. And then from there, we'd separate our 2 pieces, set those equal to 0, and then solve to get our x-intercepts. So the first one, we get that we're going to have an x-intercept at 0, 0, so our origin. And then we have x minus 8 equals 0, so add 8 to both sides. So then we have our other x-intercept at 8. So let's go ahead and draw those in our graph. All right, from here, if we want to find our y-intercept is where x is 0. So we'd have y equals, all right, so we have 0 times 0 minus 8, which is just 0. So we have our y-intercept at 0, which we should have already known because we notice here, right, it's crossing both our x and y axis, and we should know we only have one y-intercept. All right, so those are taken care of. Now we're going to find our vertex, which, remember, your vertex is going to be in the middle of your two x-intercepts. All right, so we have our x-intercepts at 0, negative 8, 0, positive 8. If we look at that on the graph, we should notice that in between there is 4. But again, you could add them up, find the average, we would still get 4. And then, right, it's not going to just be in between those 2 points. That's just the x value. But once we have the x value, we can find the y value by plugging in. All right, so into the original equation, instead of x, we know to be a vertex, our x would have to equal 4. So we're going to plug that in. Go ahead and solve that. So we end up with 4 times negative 4, and we end up with negative 16. All right, so our x is going to be positive 4, our y is going to be negative 16, and that is going to be our vertex. So let's go ahead and plot that. We're going to go to the right 4 and then down 16. All right, from there, that gives us enough points. We can go ahead and get the general shape of our parabola here. And there we have our parabola that we made completely by hand. All right, this next one here, we're going to want to factor first. All right, so what multiplies to give us a negative 9 and adds to get us, there's nothing there, so adds to get us 0. So we want these two numbers to cancel out, so we know we want them to be opposites, like positive 1 and negative 1, or positive 100 and negative 100. But we also want it to multiply to be 9. So multiplied by itself, it gets 9. What number is that? A positive 3 and a negative 3. All right, to find our x-intercept, that means y would have to be 0. And then to find those x-intercepts, we're going to set both of those parts equal to 0 and solve. Right, so we have our x-intercepts at negative 3 and positive 3. I'm going to go ahead and graph that. And then you'll notice directly in the middle of that is 0. So our y-intercept and our vertex are actually going to be the same thing here. All right, so we know our vertex is going to be in the middle, which we just said was 0. So we know our x of our vertex is 0, which we also know when x is 0, that is our y-intercept. So like I said, our vertex and our y-intercept are going to be the same thing in this problem. So we know our x is 0, so to find out y, let's plug in x is 0. And so we should notice we're going to have our vertex and our y-intercept at 0, negative 9. We'll go ahead and graph that, so not going left or right at all, but just going down 9. And then we should have a good idea of what our parabola looks like. And there you have your graph. Okay, and ending with a little bit more of a challenging problem here, we have our quadratic in standard form, but this time a is not equal to 1. So we have to do that slightly different than how we did that first one in standard form. And I do have another video completely on how to do this with grouping, which is the strategy I'm going to show you here in a second. All right, so again, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to get me something and add to get me something. But this time, since I have that number in front of my x squared, I have to keep that into consideration as well. So negative 2 times 8 gets me negative 16. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give me negative 16 and add to give me 6. All right, I'm doing this because I'm trying to factor it so I can set it equal to 0 and solve like I did before. All right, how I have it now, we can't do that. All right, so I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give me negative 16 and add to give me 6. So I'm going to go ahead and list my multiples of 16. And since it's a negative 16, I know one has to be positive, one has to be negative, and I want them to get me a positive 6. So I would need a positive 8 and a negative 2. That would get me a negative 16 multiplied together, and it would add to get me that 6. So then I'm just going to rewrite that middle part. So instead of 6x, it's going to be negative 2x and 8x. Doesn't matter which order you put those in. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite that. Notice I'm keeping the beginning the same, and then instead of 6x, I'm replacing it with those two numbers. And then leaving the end the same, that plus 8. All right, like I said, doesn't matter the order I put those x's in, that negative 2 and that 8x. If you want more info on this, go check out that video. But then from here, I'm going to group them 2 and 2. And decide what can I take out of both of those. So I can factor out a negative 2x out of that first one, which on the inside would leave me with x. Right, if I multiply this out, it would get me this. And then to get negative 2x times what gets me negative 2x? 1, right? Anything times 1 gets you itself. So that gets you that first part. The second part, we can factor out an 8. Notice your insides should match. That's how you know you did it right. So I'm going to combine my outsides. Negative 2x plus 8, and then those insides that matched. Now I have my factored form, so to find my x-intercepts, I'm going to set y equal to 0, which then means I can set both of those equal to 0 and solve. All right, so I have my two x-intercepts at 4 and negative 1. I'm going to go ahead and graph those so it crosses at negative 1 and at positive 4. All right, if we try to find the middle of that, we'll notice it's not at a whole number. Or if we find the average, 4 plus negative 1 is 3, divided by 2, we'll notice our vertex is going to be at 1.5. So we have our x at 1.5. And then remember, it's just as simple as plugging in. Right, we know our x is 1.5, so plug in to find out what y is. So up here, instead of x, I know x is 1.5 for my vertex, so I'm going to just plug in 1.5, 1.5. All right, go ahead and do that in your calculator. So 1.5 squared times negative 2 plus whatever 6 times 1.5 is plus 8. We should get that y is 12.5. So there is my vertex. I'm going to go ahead and graph that. So I'm going to go over 1 and then halfway between 1 and 2 since it's 1.5. And then I'm going to go up 12.5, so between 12 and 13. So notice my vertex is above my x-intercepts this time, so my vertex is actually the highest point rather than the lowest point like it was with those others. All right, last thing to find is our y-intercept, which super easy to find because it's in standard form. If we set our x is equal to 0, we would end up with just our constant, which is a positive 8. So I know it's crossing my y-axis at 8. Okay, which that looks like it falls in line, right? And then we're going to go ahead and connect those and get our graph. There we have our parabola, and since it was a negative, we have our parabola actually flipped upside down so that our vertex is the highest point. I hope you found these videos in this series helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. This will be the last video of the series unless I get some specific requests on anything else you'd like to see with quadratics. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe to see what is next from me. Thanks for watching.